A poor girl let a stranger and his little daughter stay for one night, not knowing he was a millionaire cowboy. The knock came like a gunshot in the dark. Sharp, sudden, breaking through the silence of a November night, so cold it hurt to breathe. Clara's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she thought she'd dreamed it. But then it came again, slow, heavy, desperate. She pulled the thin quilt around her shoulders and stumbled toward the door. Her cabin was small, just one room with a stove that barely kept the frost from creeping through the cracks. The wind outside howled like a dying animal, rattling the shutters, pressing against the walls. No one traveled this far out at night, not unless they were running or dying. Her fingers hesitated on the latch. Then she opened it. The man standing in the doorway looked like he'd walked out of hell itself. His coat was torn, his face pale and hollow, his eyes dark with something Clara couldn't name. But it was the child in his arms that made her breath catch. A little girl, no older than 5, wrapped in a ragged blanket. Her face was flushed red with fever, her small body trembling even in sleep. "Please," the man whispered. His voice cracked. "She's burning up." Clara didn't ask his name. She didn't ask where he came from or what he was running from. She just stepped aside and let him in. The stranger carried the girl to the corner near the stove and laid her down gently on Clara's only bed. His hands shook as he smoothed the blanket over her. Clara watched him for a moment, then moved quickly. She grabbed a tin cup, filled it with water from the bucket by the door, and knelt beside the child. "Drink," she said softly, lifting the girl's head. The child's lips were dry and cracked. She took a sip, coughed weakly, then closed her eyes again. Clara pressed the back of her hand to the girl's forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin like a coal pulled straight from a fire. "How long has she been like this?" Clara asked. The man didn't answer right away. He stood by the door, his hat in his hands, staring at his daughter like he was afraid she might disappear. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 days. Clara's chest tightened. 3 days was a long time for a fever like this. Too long. She rose and opened the small wooden box where she kept what little medicine she had. Dried herbs, a few strips of willow bark, a jar of honey. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She made a tea from the bark and honey, then coaxed the girl into drinking it. The stranger watched in silence, his eyes following every movement. Clara could feel his fear in the room, thick and heavy like smoke. When the girl finally settled into a quieter sleep, Clara stood and wiped her hands on her apron. She turned to the man. "You should sit," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." He shook his head. "I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to." He stared at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, slowly, he sank into the chair by the stove. Clara reached for the tin of cornmeal on the shelf, the last of what she had, and began mixing it with water. Her hands moved without thinking. She'd grown up poor. She knew what it was like to be hungry, to be cold, to be desperate. She cooked the cornbread over the stove and set a piece in front of him. He looked at it like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Then he ate in silence, slow and careful, like a man who'd forgotten what kindness tasted like. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind screamed across the plains, rattling the door, shaking the world. But inside it was quiet, almost peaceful. "What's her name?" Clara asked softly. The man swallowed. His jaw clenched. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "Rose." Clara nodded. "That's a beautiful name." He didn't respond. He just stared into the fire, his eyes distant, haunted. Clara didn't press him. She'd lived long enough on the frontier to know that some men carried things too heavy to speak aloud. Grief, guilt, regret. The West was full of men like that, cowboys, drifters, outlaws, all running from something they couldn't outrun. She rose and checked on the girl again. Rose's breathing had steadied, and the fever seemed to have eased just a little. Clara pulled the blanket higher around her small shoulders and whispered a quiet prayer under her breath. When she turned back, the stranger was watching her. His expression was soft, almost broken. "Why did you let us in?" he asked. Clara blinked. "What do you mean? You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. You have nothing, and you still gave us everything." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Because she needed help. And so did you." The man's throat worked. He looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he was holding on for life. "I don't deserve it," he said quietly. Clara sat down across from him again. "Maybe not. But she does." The silence that followed was heavy. Not uncomfortable, but full, like the space between heartbeats. Clara could see the weight pressing down on him, the exhaustion, the guilt, the love. He was a man at the end of himself. And somehow, he'd ended up at her door. She didn't ask him why. She didn't need to. The night stretched on. Clara dozed in the chair while the stranger sat awake, watching over his daughter. Every so often, she would wake and see him there, still as stone, his eyes never leaving the little girl's face. He looked like a man keeping vigil over something sacred, something he was terrified of losing. When the first light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the shutters, Clara stirred. She opened her eyes and saw that the stranger was standing. He had his coat on, his hat in his hand. Rose was still sleeping. Clara stood quickly. "You're leaving?" He nodded. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were full of something Clara couldn't name. Sorrow, gratitude, goodbye. "She's better," he said quietly. The fever broke. Clara glanced at the girl. It was true. Rose's face was no longer flushed. Her breathing was calm and steady. "Then stay," Clara said. "At least until she wakes." The man shook his head. "I can't." "Why not?" He didn't answer. He just looked at her for a long moment, like he was trying to memorize her face. Then he turned and walked to the door. Clara followed him. Wait, but he was already gone. The door swung open, and the cold morning air rushed in. Clara stepped outside and saw him walking away across the empty plain, his figure growing smaller and smaller against the pale sky. She stood there for a long time, watching until he disappeared into the distance. Then she turned and went back inside. Rose was still asleep, and on the table where the stranger had been sitting lay a folded piece of paper and a single gold coin. The paper was folded twice, pressed flat like something sacred. Clara stood in the doorway, watching the empty horizon where the stranger had disappeared, and for a moment she forgot about the letter. The morning was cold and still, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the only person left in the world. Rose was still sleeping inside, her small chest rising and falling in the soft rhythm of recovered breath. But the man, the cowboy, the drifter, whatever he was gone. Clara stepped back inside and closed the door. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know why. She walked to the table and picked up the folded paper. Beside it lay a single gold coin, heavy and worn, catching the dim light from the window. She stared at it for a long time before she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was messy, written fast, like the words had been pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "I have nothing left to give but this. You gave her warmth when the world was cold. I will never forget what you did. C.W." That was all. Clara read it 3 times. Her throat tightened. She didn't understand. The coin was more money than she'd seen in months, maybe a year. But the words felt heavier than gold. They felt like goodbye, like regret, like a man leaving behind something he couldn't carry anymore. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Then she picked up the coin and turned it over in her palm. It was real, solid. She could buy flour with this, maybe cloth, maybe enough to get through the winter without starving. But it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like an apology. Clara glanced over at Rose, still curled beneath the blanket, and wondered what kind of man left his daughter with a stranger, even for a night, and then walked away into the cold without looking back. She spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it. 3 days later, the banker came. Clara was outside hauling water from the well when she saw the black carriage rolling across the plains. It moved slow and steady, kicking up dust in the pale afternoon light. Carriages didn't come out this far. Not to her cabin. Not to anyone like her. She set the bucket down and wiped her hands on her skirt, her heart already starting to race. For a moment, she thought maybe it was the law. Maybe the stranger had been an outlaw after all, and now they were coming for her. But when the carriage stopped and the door opened, it wasn't a sheriff who stepped out. It was an older man in a dark suit, his face lined and tired. He held a leather folder under one arm and a handkerchief in the other. His eyes were red, like he'd been crying. Clara's stomach dropped. "Miss Clara Bennett?" he asked, his voice rough and quiet. She nodded, unable to speak. The man took a slow breath, like he was steadying himself. Then he said, "My name is Samuel Pritchard. I'm the estate manager for Callum Waite." Clara blinked. The name meant nothing to her. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "I don't know anyone by that name." The banker's face crumpled for just a moment. He pressed the handkerchief to his eyes, then lowered it and looked at her with something close to disbelief. "You let him in," he said softly. 3 nights ago. Him and his daughter." Clara's breath caught. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "The stranger?" Pritchard nodded. "Callum Waite, one of the richest ranchers in Wyoming, owner of the Waite Cattle Company. He owned more land than most men will ever see in their lives." Clara took a step back, her mind spinning. "That man, he was a rancher?" "He was," Pritchard said quietly, "until his wife died. And then he wasn't anything anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. Pritchard opened the leather folder and pulled out a stack of papers. His hands were shaking. "He came to my office 2 weeks ago. Said he wanted to dissolve everything. The ranch, the cattle, the accounts. I thought he'd lost his mind. I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. He said he didn't want it anymore. Said it had taken everything from him and given him nothing back." Clara's throat went dry. "What did he do?" Pritchard looked at her, and his eyes were full of something unbearable. "He signed it all away. Every acre, every dollar. And then he told me that if anything happened to him, everything was to go to a woman named Clara Bennett." The world tilted. Clara staggered backward, her hand reaching for the wall of the cabin to steady herself. "No, that's not possible." "It's already done," Pritchard said. He held out the papers. "This is the deed to the Waite Ranch. 20,000 acres. The house, the barns, the cattle, all of it. It's yours." Clara stared at the papers like they were on fire. "I don't understand." "Why would he?" "Because you let him in," Pritchard said, his voice breaking. "You didn't know who he was. You didn't know what he was worth. You just saw a man and a sick child, and you helped them. No questions. No price." He wiped his eyes again. "He told me you were the first person in 2 years who treated him like a human being instead of a fortune." Clara's legs gave out. She sank down onto the step, her head spinning, her hands trembling in her lap. She thought of the stranger's hollow eyes. The way his hands shook when he laid Rose down. The way he'd looked at her when she gave him bread, like it was the most valuable thing in the world. "Where is he now?" she whispered. Pritchard's face fell. "I don't know. He left the morning after he visited you. Took his horse and rode west. No one's seen him since." Clara pressed her hands to her face. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run after him and demand answers. But all she could do was sit there, feeling the weight of something she didn't ask for pressing down on her shoulders like a mountain. "I can't take this," she said finally. "It's not mine." "It is," Pritchard said gently. He made sure of it. "Legally, officially, there's no one else. No family. No heirs. Just you." "But I didn't do anything," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I just let them in." Pritchard knelt down in front of her, his old knees cracking. He looked at her with kind, tired eyes. Maybe that's all he needed. Clara stared at the papers in his hands. The deed. the ranch. A life she never imagined. She thought of the gold coin still sitting on her table. She thought of the letter. I have nothing left to give but this. He hadn't been apologizing for leaving. He'd been apologizing for everything he couldn't be anymore. Pritchard stood slowly and set the papers on the step beside her. Take your time, he said. But the ranch is waiting. And so is Rose. Clara's head snapped up. Rose? She's still there, Pritchard said. At the ranch. He left her with the housekeeper before he disappeared. Said she'd be safe. Said you come. Clara's chest tightened. The little girl with the fever. The child who'd slept in her bed, who'd drunk her tea, who'd looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. She was alone now, just like Clara had been. Pritchard tipped his hat and climbed back into the carriage. As it rolled away, Clara sat on the step, holding the deed in her hands, staring at the name written across the top in bold, official letters. Callum Waite, a man who had everything, and gave it all to a girl with nothing. Callum Waite stood at the edge of his land and watched it burn. Not with fire, with memory, with regret. The ranch stretched out before him in the cold gray light of dawn, 20,000 acres of grass and dust and cattle that bore his name. The barn stood tall and proud. The fences ran straight and true. The house he'd built with his own hands rose from the plains like a monument to everything he'd fought for. And he hated every inch of it. He turned away and started walking. His horse stood behind him, saddled and waiting. But Callum didn't take it. He left the reins hanging loose. Left the animal to wander back to the stables on its own. He didn't deserve to ride. Not anymore. So he walked, his boots crunching over the frozen ground, his breath clouding in the air, his heart heavy as stone. He'd been a rancher once. A cattleman. A man who built something from nothing and made a name that people respected. Callum Waite, the richest man in 3 counties. The one who owned half the cattle in Wyoming and could buy anything he wanted with a signature and a handshake. But money couldn't buy what mattered. It couldn't save his wife when the fever came. It couldn't keep her alive when her body burned and her breath rattled and her hand went cold in his. He'd ridden for 2 days straight to find a doctor, and when he finally brought one back, it was too late. She was already gone. And all his money, all his land, all his power, it meant nothing. He'd buried her on the hill, behind the house, beneath a cottonwood tree she used to sit under in the summer. He'd carved her name into a stone with his own hands. And then he'd gone back to work, because work was all he knew. Work and silence, and the weight of a world that didn't care how much you owned. Rose had been 3 years old when her mother died. She didn't understand. She'd asked for her every day for months, and every time, Callum's heart broke a little more. He tried to be strong, tried to be both mother and father. But he was a rancher, not a caretaker. He knew how to break horses and brand cattle and negotiate prices. He didn't know how to braid hair or sing lullabies or hold a little girl when she cried for someone who wasn't coming back. So he hired help, a housekeeper, a cook, women who could do what he couldn't. And he buried himself in work because work didn't ask questions. Work didn't remind him of everything he'd lost. But then Rose got sick. It started with a cough. Just a small thing, nothing to worry about. But it grew worse. The fever came, and with it, the same rattling breath he'd heard in his wife's chest 2 years before. And Callum felt the world collapse around him all over again. He rode to every town within 100 miles, looking for doctors, medicine, anything that could help. He threw money at anyone who claimed they could cure her. He prayed in churches he hadn't set foot in since he was a boy. He begged God for mercy, for time, for one more chance. But the fever didn't break, and Rose kept fading. On the 3rd night, Callum couldn't stand the ranch anymore. Couldn't stand the walls, the silence, the housekeeper's pitying eyes. He wrapped Rose in a blanket, saddled his horse, and rode out into the dark. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay. The night was freezing. The wind cut through his coat like a knife. Rose burned in his arms, her small body shaking, her breath shallow and fast. He held her close, and whispered promises he didn't know if he could keep. He told her she'd be okay, told her they'd find help, told her he wouldn't let her go. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was watching her die, just like he'd watched her mother die. And all his money, all his power, all his land, it couldn't save her. That's when he saw the light. A small cabin, far out on the plains, barely more than a shack. A single window, glowing warm in the darkness. Callum didn't think. He just rode toward it, his heart hammering, his hands shaking around Rose's small body. He knocked on the door, and when opened, he saw a girl. Young, poor. Her dress was patched and faded, her hands rough from work. She looked at him with tired eyes, and for a moment, he thought she'd turn him away. But she didn't. She didn't ask his name, didn't ask where he came from or what he wanted. She just looked at Rose, saw the fever, and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. And Callum, the man who owned half of Wyoming, broke. He carried his daughter inside and laid her down on the girl's bed. He watched as she moved quickly, quietly, gathering water and herbs and making a tea he didn't recognize. She worked with a gentleness he hadn't seen in years. She didn't rush, didn't panic. She just cared. And Rose drank the tea, and the fever slowly began to break. Callum sat in the corner and watched. He watched this poor girl give everything she had to save a child she didn't know. He watched her use her last bit of cornmeal to make him bread. He watched her tend to Rose through the night, never asking for payment, never expecting anything in return. And he realized something that tore him apart. He'd been living like a king while the world starved. He'd built an empire, but he'd never given anything away. He'd accumulated wealth, but he'd never shared it. He'd spent his life taking, claiming, building. And for what? His wife was gone. His daughter was dying. And the only kindness he'd found in 2 years came from a girl who had nothing. By dawn, Rose was breathing easier. The fever had broken. She was going to live. But Callum couldn't stay. He couldn't face the girl, couldn't face the shame that was eating him alive. So he stood, pulled his coat tight, and walked to the door. He looked back once. At Rose, sleeping peacefully. At the girl, dozing in the chair. At the simple, honest goodness of a life he'd never understood. Then he left. He walked back to the ranch, signed the papers, and gave it all away. The land, the cattle, the house, everything. He told Pritchard to give it to the girl. Told him she deserved it more than he ever had. And then he saddled his horse, took his Bible from the shelf, and rode west. He didn't know where he was going. Didn't care. He just knew he couldn't carry the weight anymore. The weight of wealth that meant nothing. The weight of a life built on taking instead of giving. The weight of guilt that crushed him every time he closed his eyes. So he rode into the desert, leaving everything behind. Everything except the memory of a girl who'd shown him what mercy looked like. The first thing Clara did was open the doors. Not just the front door of the big ranch house, all of them. The bunkhouse, the barns, the gates that had been locked for years. She walked through the property with Rose's small hand in hers, and everywhere she went, she unlocked what had been closed. The ranch hands stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am," the foreman said carefully, his hat in his hands. Mr. Waite always kept things controlled. "You sure you want to?" "I'm sure," Clara said. And that was the end of it. Within a month, word spread across Wyoming. The Waite Ranch was under new management. A young woman who didn't know the first thing about cattle or horses or running an empire. The ranchers in town shook their heads and placed bets on how long she'd last. Some said a season. Others said less. But Clara didn't care what they thought. She wasn't trying to be a rancher. She was trying to be something else. The first family arrived on a cold morning in early spring. A man, his wife, and 3 children, all thin and hungry, traveling in a wagon that looked like it might fall apart any mile. They'd heard there was work at the Waite Ranch. They didn't expect much, just a chance. Clara met them at the gate. She looked at the children's hollow eyes and the way the mother held the youngest close, like she was afraid someone might take him. And Clara saw herself, saw the girl she'd been a year ago, alone, poor, with nothing but a leaking roof and an empty pantry. "There's a cabin in the west pasture," Clara said. "It needs some work, but it's yours if you want it. And there's food in the kitchen. Come eat first." The man stared at her. "We can't pay. I didn't ask you to." The wife started crying. That's how it began. More families came. Drifters, widows, men who'd made mistakes and couldn't find work anywhere else. Cowboys who'd been blacklisted from other ranches for reasons that didn't matter anymore. Clara hired them all. She gave them cabins, wages, and something most of them hadn't felt in years: dignity. The ranch hands who'd worked for Callum Waite didn't understand at first. They'd spent years working for a man who measured everything in profit and loss, who ran the ranch like a business, cold and efficient. But Clara ran it like a home. She ate meals with the workers. She learned their names, their stories. She sat with the children in the evenings and taught them to read from the books she'd found in Callum's library. She opened the big house and let the families use the parlor on Sundays. And when someone got sick or hurt, she was the first one at their bedside. The old foreman, a grizzled cowboy named Dutch, watched her for weeks before he finally spoke up. "You're going to run this place into the ground," he said one evening, his voice rough but not unkind. Clara looked up from the ledger she was studying. "Why do you say that?" "Because you're giving everything away. You're not charging enough. You're hiring people no one else will touch. And you're feeding half the territory out of your own kitchen." Clara set down her pen. "And?" Dutch shook his head. "And that's not how you run a ranch." "I'm not running a ranch," Clara said quietly. "I'm running a home." Dutch stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his weathered face. He pulled off his hat and turned it over in his hands. "You know," he said, "Mr. Waite used to say the same thing. Before his wife died. Before he forgot what it all meant." He looked at Clara with tired, grateful eyes. "Maybe you're exactly what this place needed." Clara didn't respond. She just went back to her work. But her hands were shaking. 5 years passed. The ranch didn't fail. It thrived. Not in the way Callum Waite's empire had thrived, with wealth and power and endless expansion, but in a different way, a quieter way. The land was full of life. Children ran through the fields. Families sat together on porches in the evenings. The bunkhouse was always full, and the kitchen table was never empty. Clara grew older, but not harder. She learned how to manage cattle and balance books and negotiate with buyers in town. She learned how to lead without demanding, how to give without breaking, how to be strong without being cold. And Rose, sweet, quiet Rose, grew up beside her, learning the same lessons. The town stopped calling Clara a fool. They started calling her something else. A saint, some said. A miracle, others whispered. But Clara didn't think of herself that way. She just thought of the stranger who'd knocked on her door 5 years ago. The man who'd given her everything, because she'd given him the only thing that mattered: kindness. She never forgot him. Sometimes, late at night, she'd take out the letter he'd left behind and read it by candlelight. "I have nothing left to give but this." She wondered where he was. If he was alive. If he ever thought about the daughter he'd left behind. Rose asked about him sometimes. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" she'd say. And Clara would smile and say, "I don't know, sweetheart. But if he does, we'll be here." He came back on a Tuesday in October. Clara was in the yard, hanging laundry, when she saw him. A lone figure walking up the road. No horse, no wagon. Just a man on foot carrying a worn saddle over his shoulder and a hat in his hand. He moved slowly, like every step cost him something. At first, she didn't recognize him. He was thinner now, his face lined and weathered, his hair streaked with gray. But then he looked up, and she saw his eyes. Callum Waite. Clara's breath caught. Her hands froze on the clothesline. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. She just stared as he walked closer, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, the open gates, the families working in the fields, the children playing near the barn. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were full of something she couldn't name. relief, regret, gratitude. Clara, he said quietly. She swallowed hard. 1,000 questions ran through her mind. Where have you been? Why did you leave? Why did you come back? But none of them made it to her lips. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron and said, "You must be hungry." Callum's throat worked. He nodded, unable to speak. Clara turned and walked toward the house. She didn't look back, but she heard his footsteps behind her, slow, hesitant, like a man stepping into a place he didn't deserve to be. Inside, the kitchen was warm and full of life. Rose was there, setting the table for supper. She looked up when Clara came in, then froze when she saw the man behind her. "Rose," Clara said gently, "set another plate." The girl stared at Callum, her eyes wide. Then, slowly, she moved to the cupboard and pulled out a plate. She set it at the table without a word. Callum stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on his daughter. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked over and wrapped her arms around him. He broke. His shoulders shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. He held her like he'd been drowning, and she was the first breath of air. Clara turned away and busied herself at the stove, giving them space. When the food was ready, she set it on the table and gestured for Callum to sit. He did, his movements slow and careful, like he was afraid the chair might disappear beneath him. Clara sat across from him. Rose sat beside him. And for a long time, no one spoke. They just ate in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need words. Finally, Callum looked up. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "I don't deserve this," he said. Clara met his gaze. "Maybe not, but you're here anyway." He stared at her. Then slowly he nodded. "Welcome home," Clara said quietly. And for the first time in 5 years, Callum Waite allowed himself to believe it.